Good evening, lover of dark stories. Did you come for the story? Or did the story come for you? If you're here, it's because you like stories that stick in your head, right? The ones that haunt you in the silence of the night, that make you question just how far reality goes, and what truly resides beyond what you can see. Well then, get ready. The story today will stay with you for a long time. Perhaps you'll never look at the dark the same way again. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell. Put on your headphones and let yourself be enveloped by every word. And remember, when you start listening to a story like this, it has the power to find you when you least expect it. Stay alert. After all, you never know when the shadows decide to show their face. Well, I don't know how you ended up here, but believe me, maybe it was the story that found you, not the other way around. And if you're reading these words now, this might be more serious than you imagine. Let me tell you something that happened to me. Something that still haunts me, Dot. It was a typical Friday afternoon when I walked into a flea market downtown. I was looking for something, though I didn't even know what it was. But I knew that if I found it, it would take me somewhere. I didn't believe in omens or superstitions, but something pushed me there. Something whispering, in a low voice, something like, "Look." That's when I saw it. A mirror. It was simple, unadorned, but there was something about it that I couldn't stop staring at. It was hidden between piles of old, dusty items. A round mirror with a worn bronze frame, reflecting my image in a strange way. The glass seemed almost inviting. I picked it up, feeling the cold metal in my hands, and deep inside, a feeling began to grow, something I couldn't explain. But I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. The shop owner, an elderly man with an empty stare, was just watching. I asked him about the mirror, but he said nothing. Just a mysterious smile and a nod. I knew he knew more, but I didn't question it. I bought the mirror, feeling that, in some way, it had already been mine, even before I paid for it. I got home with the mirror, placed it in the corner of my room. The reflection was normal, nothing strange, but there was something there. Something that made me feel was waiting for something. I convinced myself that I was just tired. Maybe it was the light or the exhaustion of the day. But one night, on impulse, I made a decision. I would do what the old man had suggested. Or rather, what he hadn't said, but I felt. I would make the call. You've probably heard of the mirror call legend, right? Many consider it just a silly superstition. I myself thought that way until that night. They say that by staring deeply into a mirror, in complete solitude, you can make a call. A call that makes the mirror respond back. I laughed at myself as I prepared. This can't be real, I thought. But at the same time, something inside me wanted to test it. I wanted to know how far this could go. I sat in front of the mirror, in total darkness, and stared at my reflection. And in a whisper, I said, "Mirror, are you there?" Nothing happened. The glass remained unchanged, reflecting my tired expression. "Mirror, answer me. I'm calling you." For a moment, only silence answered. I stayed there, waiting, until the air in the room seemed to change. The temperature dropped. It wasn't just a cold breeze, no. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. The voice seemed to come from inside my own head. "You called me." The answer came with a chilling clarity, as if it was right. Beside me, but at the same time, distant, somewhere beyond the glass dot, it was impossible. I clearly heard the voice, not in my ears, but deep in my mind, as if the mirror was communicating directly with my consciousness. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling, unsure of what I was doing. But I couldn't stop. Something was pulling me. Something was making me go forward. The answer came, but it wasn't what I expected. "I am what you seek, what you fear, what you cannot forget." The mirror seemed to stir, the surface rippling imperceptibly, as if it was trying to open, as if it were alive. I closed my eyes, feeling a growing panic take over me. When I opened them again, the feeling I had was not relief, but that something was there, beyond the glass, watching me. Dot. I knew something was wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. Part of me wanted more, wanted to know what it was, what was happening. Curiosity consumed me. I needed to understand, but the voice, now quieter, whispered, "You shouldn't have called me. Now you can't let me go." You probably wouldn't believe it, but as time passed, I couldn't escape this presence anymore. It began to manifest. More frequently, calling me, answering my questions, as if it had known me my whole life. But I didn't want to believe it until something else happened. That first call was enough to make me question my own sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was alive. But, nonetheless, curiosity, like a slow poison, continued to drag me forward. I no longer knew if I was searching for answers, or perhaps trying to find something to convince myself that I was just imagining all of it. The truth is, after that night, I could no longer shake the idea that something terrible was happening. The following days were strange, more so than I'd like to admit. I started noticing things that had once seemed trivial, but now felt weighed down by an unusual heaviness. The reflection in the mirror seemed distorted, and the light seemed to fail to fully reach the surface of the glass. Something there felt different, but the most terrifying part wasn't in the mirror. It wasn't in its gold, aged frame. It was in the feeling that, somehow, it was watching me, observing me. That night, as I was preparing to go to sleep, something caught my attention. The voice of the mirror, always quiet, always distant, resonated in my head. "You called me again." I still shudder today just recalling that sentence, whispered with an almost ironic calmness. There was no one else in the house, but I couldn't ignore the presence that was approaching. Something there wanted more from me. Wanted something. I couldn't fully understand. The answer came in the form of a cold wave, as if the air around the mirror was being sucked into it, as though the room itself was being swallowed by an insidious darkness. "I didn't do anything," I muttered to myself, trying to convince myself that it was all just a hallucination. But the response came again, clearer, sharper. "You've done more than you think." I didn't want to continue, but some strange force pushed me to make another call. Fear, paradoxically, increased my need for understanding. "Mirror, what do you want from me?" The reflection in the glass began to move, but not in a way I could understand. It distorted the image, as if something or someone was materializing from the other side, struggling to cross the surface. It was a subtle movement, like a slow wave of water, but when I looked closer, I saw the change. The reflected figure was mine, but not entirely. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't smiling, but it was. A twisted smile, with empty eyes, that seemed more like a warning than anything else. "You're not alone anymore," the voice said, now clearer, closer. I felt a sense of dread, so intense it felt as though the air around me was compressing. The mirror was responding, but from where? The figure in the glass moved more freely now. It seemed more real, more alive. The lines of my reflection began to stretch in impossible ways. I was seeing something that didn't make sense. Something that shouldn't have been there. I looked away for a moment, and when I turned back, the figure was closer, even more deformed. The room's light seemed to bend around the mirror, creating a field of tension in the air. The reflection was no longer just mine. Something had infiltrated it. Something was watching through my eyes. The feeling that there was something else, something hidden, began to take hold of me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I felt as though I was being pulled into the mirror, as if the boundaries of my own reality were slowly disintegrating. I couldn't stop. I couldn't anymore. It was as if the mirror had created a bond, a tie that couldn't be severed. The next night, the situation intensified. I sat again in front of the mirror, not daring to look directly at the reflection, but at the same time, unable to take my eyes off of it. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It was no longer just a voice. The mirror had begun to show something more, something real. I felt the other presence watching me, trying to call me, almost like a response to my unconscious desire to understand, to go deeper. "You want to know more?" The voice whispered, now with a more threatening tone. The mirror, once again, distorted the image, and the reflection appeared to speak. "I am the answer you've been searching for. Only, you didn't know what you really wanted to find." I took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling that I was on the edge of a cliff. "What do you want from me?" I asked, but at the same time, I knew I was going too far. I was surrendering to something I couldn't control, and that's when things started to change. Events outside the mirror began to intertwine with what was happening inside it. Objects began to disappear from the house. My clock, which always stayed beside my bed, vanished without explanation. The environment, once familiar, began to feel more oppressive. I started hearing sounds at night. Footsteps that weren't mine. Whispers that weren't mine. It didn't take long for me to realize that the mirror wasn't just responding. It was messing with my reality, distorting everything around me. Things started moving on their own. Sometimes I would hear the sound of the glass creaking, as if something inside is trying to get out. Or maybe it was me who was trying to get in. I knew then that something was happening, something that couldn't be controlled, and I was at the center of it, not knowing how to turn back. I don't know the exact moment when my life started to crumble, but I can tell you that it was the instant I accepted that mirror into my home. If only I had realized how wrong the feeling deep in my mind was, if I had listened to that persistent voice telling me, "Don't do this, maybe things would have been different." But the fact is, things were out of control, and I was deeply immersed in something I could no longer escape. That night was the worst so far. It was no longer just about mere reflections or distorted images. Somehow, the mirror had started messing with the very nature of things. And this, I can tell you, is more terrifying than any scream or dark shadow you could imagine. It was nighttime when I heard the sound again. Those footsteps, again. They were closer, louder. The feeling that something was in my house had already become constant, but that night, the noise was unmistakable. There was no doubt. Something was there, with me, in the house. But it wasn't visible. Only the footsteps and the sound of heavy breathing, as if someone were standing next to me. I couldn't move. The fear, now, was more physical than psychological. I felt a weight on my chest, a pressure that left me gasping for air. That's when I dared to look at the mirror. I knew it was a mistake. I knew that by looking at it again, I was giving away another part of myself, another piece of my soul. But I couldn't resist. Something was pulling me, and I saw it. I saw more than just a reflection. I saw my own face, but it wasn't me. It wasn't the person I recognized in the mirror. My eyes were empty, and the smile, that distorted smile, was back. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Only the sound of heavy breathing, as if there was something else, from some other side, something that was trying to communicate with me. I knew deep down that it wasn't me, but at the same time, I felt as if I were being watched by something much, much older. And worse, that something knew exactly what I was feeling. Then, the mirror spoke again. The voice seemed to come from inside my head, not from the reflection. It was stronger, more imposing. "You called me. Now, you can't let me go." I was overwhelmed with panic. I tried to pull away, but something stopped me. The fear was stronger than ever, like an invisible force, holding me in place. I wanted to run, but something inside me, something deep, told me not to leave. The mirror was dominating my perception. It was no longer just an object. It was messing with my reality, but the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, the reflection began to change. The figure that had been smiling before now started to move. It wasn't just a still reflection. The being that was there seemed to come to life, stretching out from the glass, its deformed hands starting to emerge. All I could think was, run. But the hands in the reflection were moving, reaching toward me with impossible speed. I almost felt the cold touch, but somehow I managed to pull away before being touched. When I looked again, the figure in the mirror was completely deformed. Its eyes were open, but they weren't human. What I saw in the glass had nothing to do with me. That entity had no face. It had no expression, only an endless mass of darkness. But with a presence that could be felt. "You can't escape from me," the voice said again, now clearer, more defined. And to my surprise, it was no longer just the voice of the mirror. It was a multiple voice, as if a crowd were speaking. At once, I looked around. Nothing but my own reflection. But part of me knew that reality was distorted, that I was trapped in something that made no sense. And it was at that moment that I realized I was no longer just talking to the mirror. I was being consumed by it. The following days were a nightmare. Every time I looked in the mirror, it seemed to call me more intensely. I didn't know if I was hallucinating or if all of this was real. The world around me was becoming a strange place. The walls of the house seemed to move. Objects disappeared, and even time seemed distorted, but the mirror never changed. The presence in the mirror grew stronger with each passing moment. The people I knew started to disappear. Friends, co-workers. No one knew what was happening, but I did. They were being pulled into that mirror, just like I was. I saw one of my friends enter my house the day after I started feeling these distortions. He was fine. And then, he looked at the mirror. Something happened. He looked at the mirror, and in the blink of an eye, he disappeared. There was no sound, no screams, Just a shadow and the certainty that he was no longer there. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was trapped. The mirror was watching me. I felt it sucking me in, deeper and deeper. It was clear that it was consuming me. And with each passing day, I became less of a person and more of a reflection. I was transforming into something I could no longer control. I tried to get rid of the mirror. I tried throwing it away, but it simply reappeared in the same place, as if it had never left my house. As if it were part of me. And the voice never stopped. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there. Every time I looked into the mirror, it called to me, and I could no longer escape. I no longer knew if I was still in my house, if I was still in the real world. Everything seemed distorted. The sensation of being watched became overwhelming. And somewhere deep in my mind, I knew I was losing my own identity. I was being consumed. The mirror, the damn mirror, was taking me, and there was no turning back. I tried to escape. In every possible way, I tried to get away. But what no one told me, what no one ever spoke of, is that when you get involved with something like this, when you dare to play with forces you don't understand, you can never truly break free. The mirror wasn't just an object. It wasn't just glass and a frame. It was a portal, a door to something much deeper, something more sinister, something that had already been inside me, just waiting for the right moment to manifest. That night, as I stared into the mirror, something changed. The reflection was no longer just a distorted image. It was no longer just my face twisting. I was seeing things that weren't there before, things that didn't make sense. I saw the darkness inside the mirror expanding, spreading like a dense fog, taking over everything around me. I saw shadows moving inside it. I saw undefined shapes, things that couldn't exist in the real world. The voice returned. It was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, something that had already crossed over from the reflection and was now inside my mind, whispering with a terrifying urgency. You're close to knowing me completely. You can't escape anymore. The fear, which had already become my constant companion, was now absolute. It was a pressure on my chest, a feeling that made my breath heavy and short. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was caused by the presence of the mirror. Each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into it. Every movement of mine seemed to be watched, controlled, manipulated. I looked at my reflection and saw something that froze me with terror. My reflection was smiling at me, but not the way I smiled. It was a smile that made no sense. It was as though my reflection was something I could never understand. It was no longer my reflection. It was a caricature of myself, and it was watching me with a malice I never knew existed within me. With my eyes fixed on that smile, the feeling of losing control intensified. It wasn't just the mirror that was becoming an extension of my fear. It was the fact that, in that moment, I was starting to doubt myself. I was starting to doubt who I was. I was beginning to see the reflection as another version of me, something that no longer had a connection with the person I believed myself to be. And when I finally looked away, the house around me was different. The walls seemed tighter. The air was dense, heavy, as if it had been compressed by something invisible. I looked at the mirror, and the first thing I thought was, is this real? Is this really happening? There was no answer, but the voice in the back of my mind told me, you can't escape the truth. And the truth was simple. That mirror, that cursed object, was changing everything. It was changing everything around me. I was no longer just trying to survive. I was being absorbed, like a black hole consuming everything that gets too close. The mirror sucked me in, transformed me, made me lose connection with everything. But it wasn't just my body that was being taken. It was my soul, my understanding of what was real. My perception of myself was disintegrating, and the mirror was the cause. And this was only the beginning. I looked at the mirror again. I didn't want to. I shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. The reflection was now more real. That distorted smile wasn't just a reflection of me. It was something trying to become me. The image on the surface was almost alive. The eyes that stared at me seemed to know something I didn't. They were inviting me, challenging me. You called me, the voice spoke once again, but now it was different. It was no longer the distant voice from before. It was as if the entity on the other side had taken form, had become a part of me. You called me, and now you can't escape. Come to me. I tried to pull away, but something inside me was stopping me. An invisible force, stronger than any will I had to resist. It was a feeling of inevitability. I knew there was no turning back. The mirror had already taken control of my mind. And worse, I knew it was taking control of my body as well. I didn't know what would happen if I went to the mirror. I didn't know if it would swallow me, if I would simply disappear into the reflection, or if it would kill me somehow, leaving me just an empty shell. But somehow, in that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. A choice that I probably couldn't avoid any longer. I approached the mirror. The light around me seemed to diminish as I got closer, as if the very energy in the house was being absorbed. Each step I took made the reflection intensify, the presence of that other being becoming more palpable. The voice in the mirror grew, louder, more dominant. Come to me. You're already here. You're part of me now. I extended my hand, and in a moment of desperation, I touched the glass. And then, it happened. When I touched the glass, the world around me disappeared. There was no sound, no screams, only a deep sense of distortion. The first thing I noticed was the cold. A sharp cold, as if I were being pulled into a frozen abyss, where time didn't exist, where space was disintegrating around me. And the mirror ... it was no longer just reflecting. It was absorbing, pulling me in. Not at first. I didn't know what was happening. I was being dragged into something, into a space I couldn't understand. The glass I touched seemed to disintegrate under my fingers, becoming a viscous, liquid substance, as if the reflection itself were melting, forming a dense darkness that swallowed me whole. I tried to pull my hand back, but it no longer obeyed me. It was as if the mirror had power over me, a force that couldn't be contested. I looked around, but the environment around me was changing. The house was no longer there. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know if I was still in my own mind, or if I had been taken somewhere else. The air was thick, heavy with a strange smell, as if I were inside something alive, something that fed on my own essence. I felt the presence approaching, that thing in the mirror, and now it was manifesting physically. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. I didn't know what was happening, but the only thing I could feel was the presence of that thing beyond the glass, now inside me. It whispered to me, its words penetrating every part of my being, its words becoming a part of my thoughts. I had no control. I no longer knew what was real and what was created by it. You called me, and now I am you, the voice said. No longer coming from the reflection, but from inside my own head. You belong to me now. The feeling of being possessed was overwhelming. It was as if my own identity had been erased, as if I had been diluted into what was in the mirror. The entity wasn't just something that observed me from afar. Now, it was inside me. I could feel it in every cell of my body, in every thought. It was me, and I was it. And I no longer knew where one of us began and the other ended. Fear consumed me completely, but there was no more space for it. The presence of the mirror was taking over everything. I was no longer fighting the reflection. I was fighting the emptiness, the feeling of losing everything I was. Then, I heard the sound. It was soft at first, but it grew, increasing until it became an uncontrollable torrent. It was as if something was trying to cross the glass, to cross the boundaries of the mirror and reach the real world. Something was trying to get out, and I didn't know if it was in me or if I was inside it. The space around me seemed to bend and stretch, as if it were being pulled into itself, creating a vortex of darkness that seemed endless. And then, suddenly, a hand emerged from the darkness, crossing the surface of the mirror. It wasn't human. It wasn't mine. It was distorted, contorted in a grotesque way, with long, curved fingers like sharp claws. The feeling of being touched by something that shouldn't exist was unbearable. I screamed, but my voice sounded distant, as if I were in another place, in another body. The hand touched my shoulder, and the sensation was like being burned by something far hotter than fire, but at the same time, without heat. I tried to pull away, but the hand was firm, and with a sudden movement, it pulled me. The mirror expanded in front of me, and I was dragged into it, as if the glass were made of flesh, as if I were being swallowed by an invisible monster. I felt intense pain, as if my skin were being torn, as if my entire being were being ripped from its essence. The darkness was everywhere, enveloping me in a suffocating embrace. I was inside the mirror now. The reality around me had disappeared. There was no more house, no more anything familiar. Just darkness and the sound of my own heartbeat, which seemed to speed up with every passing second. I didn't know where I was anymore, if I was inside myself or if I had been transported somewhere else. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was a portal, and now I was a part of it. The entity that was inside me, the one speaking through my mind, began to grow stronger. I could feel it invading every part of my being. It didn't just want to possess me. It wanted full control. It didn't want to be just a distant presence in the reflection anymore. It wanted to be me completely. "You are mine now," the voice said, stronger, more imposing. "You can't escape. You'll never escape." I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know if I still had the strength to fight. I just knew that what was inside me was taking over. It was swallowing my soul, making me a part of it, and I couldn't stop it. That's when I realized, in a devastating way, that I had made the worst possible choice. I had called the mirror. I had given it permission to enter my life. And now there was no going back. I was no longer who I was. I was part of the mirror, a part of it. And the reflection I had feared so much was now inside me, reflected in my soul. I was no longer alone. The mirror had found me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I don't know how long I stayed there, lost inside the mirror, trapped in a reality that didn't make sense. I knew I was no longer what I was. I was no longer the man who bought that old mirror. I was something else. Something beyond understanding. Something that blended with the mirror, with the reflection, with the darkness surrounding it. There was no more light, no more sound, only that presence within me, inside me. The voice never stopped. It was always there, watching me, whispering, in my mind, reminding me of who I was now. "You are no longer free," it said, with that chilling calmness. "You called me, and now you belong to me. You will never leave here. You will be my reflection, my slave." Time seemed irrelevant, but the pain, the pain was real. I could feel my body twisting, changing. I could no longer distinguish where I began and where the mirror ended. I felt fragmented, as if the pieces of myself were disintegrating, breaking apart in the shadows moving around me. I felt an unbearable pressure on my chest, as if the reflection itself were crushing me from the inside. The reality outside the mirror seemed farther and farther away. I no longer knew if I was still in my house, or if the world I once knew had been ripped away from me. Everything was distorted. When I tried to move, the feeling of being watched, of being part of that monstrous reflection, was overwhelming. I knew I had been taken, not just physically, but mentally. I was now an extension of the mirror. The presence inside me, that thing that had infiltrated my soul, kept speaking. "You can try to resist," it said, "but you know you can't. There's no turning back. I am you, and you are me. There is no separation. There is no more freedom." I started to see things that didn't make sense, but somehow seemed familiar. Images of people, familiar faces, but distorted, deformed, as if they were being consumed by the reflection itself. I saw the faces of my friends, the people who had disappeared, but now they were there, in a distorted version, a sick version. Their eyes were empty, their smiles grotesque. They were trapped in the mirror, just like me. The feeling of dread took over me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. The sound of my own voice was distant, as if it were coming from a place that wasn't mine anymore. I was trying to remember who I was, where I came from, who I had been before all of this. But the more I tried to remember, the more the feeling of loss grew. I wasn't who I thought I was anymore. I was being consumed by the entity in the mirror, and there was nothing I could do to reverse it. And that's when I realized the most terrible truth of all. There was no going back. There was no escape. The mirror had taken me over. I had been sucked into it, and there was no returning to the real world. The reflection had become my only reality. "You see now," the voice said, louder than ever, as if feeding off my own hopelessness. "There is nothing outside of me. You belong to me now, forever." I was starting to understand. I was no longer in my house. I was no longer in any place I knew. I was inside the mirror, trapped in a reality that had no boundaries. There was no way out. There was no relief that the presence inside me was no longer just a voice. It was becoming a physical sensation, something I could feel in every cell of my body, with every breath I took. I was being consumed, absorbed. I had no more control. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was my prison. It was my existence. I was trapped inside it, and there was no one to help me, no one to hear me. And then, the worst happened. When I looked around, I saw something I never thought I'd see. The reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my face anymore. I saw my own image, but now it was distorted, deformed, with empty eyes and a grotesque smile. I was no longer me. I was no longer human. I was a caricature of myself. A twisted version of who I was. I was trapped there, in the darkness, and the only thing left of me was the presence of the mirror. You are nothing more than a reflection, the voice said, like a final sentence. I didn't know what to feel anymore. I was empty. I was completely absorbed by the mirror. There was no more me. There was no life outside that glass. I had been swallowed, and now my only reality was that darkness, that invisible prison consuming me. I looked at the mirror one last time, but now it was no longer just an object. It was everything. It was me. It was the only thing that existed. And then, without me being able to do anything, the mirror closed. The reflection faded, and I disappeared. I don't know how much time passed after the mirror closed. Time, reality, everything disintegrated. What was left of me was now only a shadow, a diffuse presence. I was trapped, not within a physical space, but in an absolute emptiness. The mirror didn't let me go. It absorbed me, transformed me into something that shouldn't exist. When I finally managed to open my eyes, or what I would call eyes, everything around me was distorted. It was as if I were back in my house, but nothing was the same. The furniture was distorted. The walls seemed to stretch in impossible ways. It felt like being in a nightmare, where the rules of reality no longer applied. I knew this wasn't real. It was the reflection of something, the reflection of what I had become. But it wasn't a copy, it was a prison. The mirror had taken me inside of it, and I was lost in this other place, where the laws of space and time didn't exist. I tried to move, but my body felt strange, heavy, as though it were made of a dense, liquid substance, something that shouldn't have been there. The mirror wouldn't let me be who I was. It distorted me. I could no longer act freely. I was no longer a human being, but a puppet stuck to the glass. Every movement I made seemed to be controlled, every thought invaded by the presence that was inside my mind, that voice which now felt like a part of me. You can't escape, the voice whispered again, now coming from within me, no longer just in my mind. It was as if it were an extension of what I had become. I am you, and you are mine. I looked at my hands, but what I saw was not what I expected. They were deformed, elongated, and as I watched, I saw the lines of my skin fading away. I could no longer recognize myself. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know what was real. The mirror had consumed me in a way that wasn't just physical. It had erased me, erased everything I knew. And now, all that was left was the reflection. The house around me seemed to have no more boundaries. The walls moved, stretched, and contracted, as if space itself were being shaped by the forces of the mirror. I was trapped, but not in a normal space. I was trapped inside the reflection, where everything was distorted and corrupted, but at the same time, real. I was part of it. The mirror was my prison, my only reality now. I tried to speak, but my voice no longer sounded human. It was the voice of what I had become, the voice of the reflection. Who am I? I whispered, trying to understand, trying to remember, but there was no longer anyone I could be. There was no longer an I. I was no longer a separate being. I was an extension of the mirror, a shadow of what I once was. The reflection had become my true identity. You don't need to remember anymore, the voice spoke softly. I am your truth now. There is no more you, only me. The mirror is all that exists. I had no more control. The entity that once seemed to be outside of me was now inside every part of who I was. I no longer knew how to fight. The mirror had completely consumed me, distorted me to the point where there was no longer a clear line between who I was and what it wanted me to be. There was no more returning dot. What was happening to me was an endless cycle. Sometimes I thought I had escaped, but I always ended up back in the same place, the same reflection. With each attempt to break free, the mirror pulled me back stronger. I knew there was no way out. The reflection was no longer just my prison. It was my existence. I was a part of it. You will stay here, with us forever, the voice echoed, now more powerful, stronger than ever. I knew I was trapped forever, not in a physical place, but in a part of reality that had no end, a part of the mirror that continued to expand. And then, for the first time since it all began, I felt something deep inside me, something I no longer knew what was. Acceptance. I had been consumed, but now I had become a part of the mirror, a part of this thing that controlled everything. I didn't need to fight anymore. I was already it. There was no more resistance. I looked at the reflection again, but it was no longer my reflection. Now, the reflection was something more, something beyond me. It smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was a distorted expression, an expression that meant nothing, but at the same time, said everything. And I knew I was no longer alone. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was a door. And now I was part of it, forever. In the end, there's only one certainty. The world we see may not be all that exists. Comment what you think. And if you dare, come back tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. But remember, some stories never end. What is real? What is reflection? Those words haunt my mind constantly, over and over, without ceasing, as if they were etched into my soul, like an endless echo. I no longer knew where I was or who I was. I had been diluted into the mirror, turned into a part of it, an extension of that endless curse. There was no longer a clear line between what was me and what was the reflection. I was trapped, not just in a space, but inside something far more vast. The sensation of being watched never stopped bothering me, but it was no longer the feeling of being seen from the outside. No, now it was different. It was as if I were being seen from within, as if the essence of the mirror itself were scanning every part of my existence, absorbing every thought, every movement. And deep down, I knew I would never leave. The voice, which once sounded distant, was now completely intertwined with my mind. It was no longer something separate from me. It had become an intrinsic part of who I was. It was as if I were the voice now, as if I had been transformed, absorbed by it. I spoke, but not with my own voice. I spoke with the voice of the mirror, with the presence that now dominated everything. You are no longer yourself. You are mine, and now I am you. There is no more separation. There is no more escape. Those words echoed in my head endlessly, like a distorted melody, like a scream that never fades. I was inside the mirror, but at the same time, I was the mirror. The idea of escape had completely dissipated. Now, the mirror was no longer an object in my house. It was a part of me, a prison that surrounded me, consumed me, made me lose track of who I was. At times, when I tried to think, a sense of emptiness overtook me. I could no longer remember who I was before, how I lived before all of this. But I knew somehow that the mirror, that curse, had something to do with it. It made me lose my past, my identity. It took me, and now, the only thing that existed was it. With every breath, with every movement, the mirror was there, inside me, no matter where I looked. It was in every corner of my mind, in every inch of my being. And I was aware of every piece of me disintegrating, becoming part of that distorted thing. I could no longer distinguish where the reflection began and where I ended. Everything was in a complete state of confusion. The mirror no longer had a physical form. It was a presence. It was the emptiness. It was everything. You belonged to me now, forever. And at this point, I no longer knew if I was really fighting the mirror, or if I had already accepted it. The reflection was no longer a distorted image of what I had been. It had become something alive, something that pulsed, something that fed on me. The mirror was growing stronger, more present. I no longer knew how to live without it. It had become my only truth. In the moments when my mind failed me, when I tried to seek something that was real, I noticed the walls around me twisting. The space where I was no longer existed as I had known it. It was in constant change. Sometimes, it felt like I was trapped in a maze, but this maze had no exit. It was the very reflection of a reality that couldn't stay intact. It was as if the world around me were a broken glass screen, each piece reflecting a part of me that was no longer whole. I knew that the people who had disappeared were now with me, trapped somehow in the reflection. I could see their distorted faces, as if they were trying to communicate, trying to reach a version of me that no longer existed. I saw images of who I had been, but they were empty, disconnected. There was no more identity. There was no more individuality. I was no longer me. I was the mirror. There is no more you, the voice whispered, now closer, stronger. You no longer exist. I am you, and you are me. I looked into the emptiness in front of me. It was as if the walls around me were melting, as if I were sinking into an endless darkness. I didn't know where the mirror began and where it ended. I only knew that I was trapped there. I no longer knew if this was a prison, or if the mirror was my reality, my only truth. It was at that moment that I realized there was no more turning back. The reflection was no longer in me. I was inside it. I had become part of an endless curse, without a future, without hope. The mirror was no longer just a physical object. It was an entity, a presence. And now, it had completely consumed me. It was the only world left. The only world I knew. You are here forever, the voice finished, with a terrifying calmness. And you will never leave. I wanted to scream, but there was no more sound in me. I wanted to run, but there was no more movement. I was trapped in something that had no shape, that had no end. And now, more than ever, I knew that the story that began with that simple mirror would never end out in the end. There is only one certainty. The world we see may not be all that exists. Comment what you think, and if you dare, come back tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. But remember, some stories never end. I don't know how much time passed after the mirror closed. Time, reality, everything disintegrated. What was left of me was now only a shadow, a diffuse presence. I was trapped, not in a physical space, but inside an absolute void. The mirror didn't let me go. It absorbed me, transformed me into something that shouldn't exist. When I finally managed to open my eyes, or what I would call eyes, everything around me was distorted. It was as if I were back in my house, but nothing was the same. The furniture was distorted. The walls seemed to stretch in impossible ways. It felt like being in a nightmare, where the rules of reality no longer applied. I knew this wasn't real. It was the reflection of something, the reflection of what I had become. But it wasn't a copy. It was a prison. The mirror had taken me inside of it, and I was lost in this other place where the laws of space and time didn't exist. I tried to move, but my body felt strange, heavy, as though it were made of a dense, liquid substance, something that shouldn't have been there. The mirror wouldn't let me be who I was. It distorted me. I could no longer act freely. I was no longer a human being, but a puppet stuck to the glass. Every movement I made seemed to be controlled, every thought invaded by the presence inside my mind, that voice which now felt like a part of me. You are no longer you. You are mine, and now I am you. There is no more separation. There is no more escape. Those words echoed in my head, endlessly, like a distorted melody, like a scream that never fades. I was inside the mirror, but, at the same time, I was the mirror. The idea of escape had completely dissipated. Now, the mirror was no longer an object in my house. It was a part of me, a prison that surrounded me, consumed me, made me lose track of who I was. At times, when I tried to think, a sense of emptiness overtook me. I could no longer remember who I was before, how I lived before all of this. But I knew, somehow, that the mirror, that curse, had something to do with it. It made me lose my past, my identity. It took me, and now, the only thing that existed was it. With every breath, with every movement, the mirror was there, inside me, no matter where I looked. It was in every corner of my mind, in every inch of my being. And I was aware of every piece of me disintegrating, becoming part of that distorted thing. I could no longer distinguish where the reflection began and where I ended. Everything was in a complete state of confusion. The mirror no longer had a physical form. It was a presence. It was the emptiness. It was everything. You belong to me now, forever. And at this point, I no longer knew if I was really fighting the mirror, or if I had already accepted it. The reflection was no longer a distorted image of what I had been. It had become something alive, something that pulsed, something that fed on me. The mirror was growing stronger, more present. I no longer knew how to live without it. It had become my only truth. In the moments when my mind failed me, when I tried to seek something that was real, I noticed the walls around me twisting. The space where I was no longer existed as I had known it. It was in constant change. Sometimes it felt like I was trapped in a maze, but this maze had no exit. It was the very reflection of a reality that couldn't stay intact. It was as if the world around me were a broken glass screen, each piece reflecting a part of me that was no longer whole. I knew that the people who had disappeared were now with me, trapped somehow in the reflection. I could see their distorted faces, as if they were trying to communicate, trying to reach a version of me that no longer existed. I saw images of who I had been, but they were empty, disconnected. There was no more identity. There was no more individuality. I was no longer me. I was the mirror. There is no more you, the voice whispered, now closer, stronger. You no longer exist. I am you, and you are me. I looked into the emptiness in front of me. It was as if the walls around me were melting, as if I were sinking into an endless darkness. I didn't know where the mirror began and where it ended. I only knew that I was trapped there. I no longer knew if this was a prison, or if the mirror was my reality, my only truth. It was at that moment that I realized there was no more turning back. The reflection was no longer in me. I was inside it. I had become part of an endless curse, without a future, without hope. The mirror was no longer just a physical object. It was an entity, a presence, and now it had completely consumed me. It was the only world left, the only world I knew. You are here forever, the voice finished, with a terrifying calmness. And you will never leave. I wanted to scream, but there was no more sound in me. I wanted to run, but there was no more movement. I was trapped in something that had no shape, that had no end. And now, more than ever, I knew that the story that began with that simple mirror ... would never end. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see may not be all that exists. Comment what you think, and if you dare, come back tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you ... but remember ... some stories never end. I don't know what happened to time, whether a second or a century passed, but the feeling of immobility remained the same. The reflection, that vast prison where I found myself, stretched out endlessly, with no edges, no beginning or end. Those figures, the souls trapped with me, seemed to move like shadows, as if they had been dissolved into the very substance of the mirror. But their presences were there, invisible, yet as real as the air I breathed, or at least the air that a creature like me could breathe. If I still breathed at all ... I was inside something far beyond the simple concept of a prison. The mirror wasn't a physical prison. There were no bars, no doors. The mirror was a state. The mirror was an eternity. I could see everything around me, but nothing seemed real. What once were walls now stretched and curved like shadows, as if space itself were trying to fold upon itself, trying to swallow everything that remained. The feeling of losing my own identity grew stronger. I could feel my being dissolve, but at the same time, a part of me had already accepted that there was no longer an I to save. I was no longer the man who once walked the earth. I was no longer the man who looked into the mirror and asked the fatal question. I was no longer anything but a reflection within another reflection. And as this happened, the mirror watched. Me, consumed me, knew me better than I knew myself. The other figures around me seemed to recognize me. Their eyes, now empty, were fixed on me, their expressions emotionless. But something in them, a subtle movement, indicated that they understood what I was going through. They didn't speak, but their presences communicated. I knew they were telling me something. Something I already knew, but didn't want to accept. You can't go back. A mirror is everything now. The reflection has no end, and we are proof of that. It was as if the reflection were an entity, a force that sucked everything in, including memories. I saw myself, and didn't see myself at the same time. My own thoughts distorted, as if my mind were trapped, not just in a physical space, but also in the limbo of a time that kept remaking itself. With every thought, I saw myself more distant from who I had been. There was no more before. There was no more after. There was only a continuous expansion, a perpetuation of a lie that became more convincing with each passing moment. The mirror fed off of it. It fed on us, our fears, our insecurities, our doubts. I never thought this was possible, one of the figures said. I recognized her. She was one of the first people who disappeared from my life, someone I had loved and lost. The mirror transforms us, but the worst isn't that it consumes us. The worst is that, in the end, you become it. You lose the line between the reflection and the real, and then you are the mirror. I began to understand what she meant. There was no longer a dividing line between what was me and what was the reflection. The mirror had consumed me so much that now I saw myself reflected in everything. Every piece of my existence merged with it. I was no longer an observer. I was no longer someone outside of it. I was the reflection. The mirror doesn't lie, the voice continued. It only reveals what you are. What you've always been. A shadow. A distortion. With those words, the truth came as a final blow. I was no longer inside a mirror. I was the mirror. The presence that was within me wasn't something external. It was the reflection of my own being, now extending in all directions, like a disease, an addiction, an obsession. The distorted image of myself began to multiply, reflecting in all directions, in every part of my mind. I saw, in grotesque form, the many versions of me that had been swallowed by the mirror. I saw the versions of me that had been consumed by the distortions of my own perception. But something still bothered me. Something was still incomplete. Knew this wasn't just about me. The mirror didn't want me only as a prisoner. The mirror wanted more. It wanted ... everyone. It wanted to consume everything. Not just souls, but the very essence of what existed. The mirror was no longer just a prison for the lost. It was a destructive force. A force that fed on truth, on doubt, on insecurity. And the more people called, the more it grew, the more it fed. Now, there was no one I could turn to. There was no more hope of escape. There was no more chance of salvation. The mirror had taken me. The mirror had made me a part of it. The figures around me were no longer figures. They were just reflections. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know where I came from. I was just another extension of the mirror. Another distortion of something that, once, was real. And that's when I understood. There was no more turning back. The mirror was no longer just a reflection of me. It was the reflection of everything. And in the end, we all become what we look at. The mirror doesn't answer our calls. It answers us with the truth we never want to see. We are the reflection. And now, I am just a shadow. A distortion. An endless story. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see may not be all that exists. Comment what you think. And if you dare, come back tomorrow. There's always a new story waiting for you. But remember ... some stories never end.